Chair.
I'm going to call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Mr. Chair, this is the government. This is the government that in 2012, when Microsoft, with which this government has major contracts in every government agency for the computers that run in every government agency. In 2012, when Microsoft announced that a software program called XP was going to run out and they were going to stop servicing it and bring in other programs, this government basically ignored that direction, did very little about it, and when it came to 2014, when the actual servicing by Microsoft ran out, there were 20,000 computers in DHBs and more than 20,000 across government agencies that were still running a software product that Microsoft no longer serviced, which meant that they were vulnerable to attack. And Mr. Chair, if that doesn't give you an indication of how this government approaches big IT projects, managing across agencies, of something that should be quite simple to manage, it couldn't even do that. And when you looked at the cabinet papers that came out on that issue, they said it was too hard because it was about managing across agencies. What this government can't do is manage big projects across agencies, and what we have before us in the House today is a piece of legislation that's been put forward and the work hasn't been done. The work hasn't been done to prepare the groundwork for how something like a New Zealand business number, which on paper and in concept seems to be not a too difficult concept to get your head around, how they could actually put it into practice. So when this bill came to the Select Committee, it had a section in it, section 34, which mandated all government agencies to introduce a New Zealand business number. And this side of the House, all of the opposition parties that sat in the Select Committee agreed that the intent of this bill was good, that it was sensible, that ultimately that it should be done. And yes, there was discussion about how that would ensue and what sort of mechanism would be used. But we supported that. When the bill has come back to the House, mysteriously, that clause has now disappeared and has been replaced with section 28, which is that government agencies may use the New Zealand business number. And we hear through other contributions in the House this afternoon as to why that is the case, is that it was all going to be too hard and the work hadn't been done. So we have two amendments that have been put up this afternoon. One from Ria Bond. I congratulate you on the amendment that you've put forward, and the other one by my colleague David Clark, who again, and both those amendments deal with the two flaws that are in this bill, Mr. Chair. The two flaws in this bill are, number one, that there is no mandate for government agencies to adopt this legislation, which does make it a farce. And number two, that there is no timeline for a process, for any process for this to occur. So it could be 10 years' time that we see that many of the agencies, the government departments, have not gone ahead and taken up this legislation. So it does seem to be rather a farce. Mr. Chair, in the discussion in Select Committee, in the submissions in the Select Committee on this bill, there were numerous submissions from agencies, from the private sector, which asked for this to be for this bill to apply to all government agencies and for that to be mandated in the bill. And that was fair enough. That was absolutely fair enough. If the private sector is being required to institute a business number, why then isn't the public sector? And why hasn't there been, and we had numerous debates on whether there should be any exemptions within the private sector and what those exemptions should entail. But when it came to the public sector, that clause disappeared, and it became as if it was all too hard. So I want to actually list what some of those, Mr Chair.
Claire Curran.
What some of those agencies said. The Business Central and Wellington Employers Chambers of Commerce said that they were concerned that the intent of the New Zealand business number may be undermined if government aid departments continue to use their own business identifier numbers. There must be a smooth transition, and the use of dual numbers should not be a barrier to full implementation. The Chartered Accountants, as we've heard earlier, said that they were disappointed that clause 34 in the exposure draft of the bill had been removed from the bill. Federated Farmers said as many government agencies as possible should adopt the New Zealand business number as soon as practicable. GSI New Zealand said it is critical that government agencies commit to and meet published timetables for implementation of the New Zealand business number. The New Zealand Chambers of Commerce said government departments should transition into the system once implemented, and they cautioned against a staggered approach. Mr Chair, these are heavy hitters. These are what they said, and yet basically the advice from officials was that this was outside the scope of the bill as it was emerging through the Select Committee, and that would now be implemented through government directives. The problem is, Mr Chair, that this is a piece of legislation that went through extensive discussions, and it's come back watered down, and you could even use the word neutered as a result. And and what it shows is that there is a veneer of organisation from this government. Behind it lies the lack of preparation. I think this bill has had 3, maybe 4 ministers have carriage of it. I don't think there's been any strategy that's gone on behind it, and that is a real shame. And it's not the only piece of legislation. My colleague David Parker referenced other legislation. The Harmful Digital Communications Bill is another example of a piece of legislation passed by this government in seemingly a hurry, and then which implemented a new criminal offence for people in the cyber environment and cyberbullying, but one of the major parts of the legislation, which is the creation of an approved agency and a means for which parents, particularly people who have got children who are being bullied online, can go somewhere, are unable to. It's more than a year since that nearly a year since that legislation passed. The relevance, Mr Chair, is that it's another example of government not being prepared when they bring a piece of legislation to the House. They haven't done the work. The Harmful Digital Communications Bill, that approved agency has still not been appointed. There is nowhere for parents to go for mediation when there has been cyberbullying occurred. With this New Zealand business number bill, we have no idea as to when the public sector is going to fulfil the intent of this bill, and what the timeline will be, whether or not government agencies, major government agencies, will actually take it on, and when they will take it on. Mr Chair, this is a problematic bill. And what we have before us today is a neutered bill that does not fulfil the intent, the original intent.
I call Chris Farfoy.